and what are some of the benefits of using public land for affordable housing, and a little bit of what are some of the challenges. Next, the flow is going to be to have a presentation from Nina Genopol from the Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing, talking about an intriguing success story involving public land in Arlington, Virginia, the Arlington Mill Residences. This is a 100% affordable housing property recently completed on county-owned land alongside a new community center. From there, I'm going to be taking back the microphone and walking through some lessons from this and other case studies that could be useful for crafting effective public land development strategies and public land policies. And then we hope to leave about 15 minutes to field your questions and comments. Let me walk through the rest of this. So first of all, just to jump in, so localities are increasingly looking at publicly owned buildings, public land holdings, and the development of new public facilities as opportunities for building mixed income and 100% affordable housing. And they're finding these opportunities in more creative places, like co-locating affordable housing with new libraries, community centers, hospitals, even fire stations in some cases. They're converting no longer needed municipal buildings into housing or mixed use. They're redeveloping underused parking lots and sprawling facility complexes with affordable housing. And we were intrigued to find out why this might be valuable, why this might be prized as an asset. Some of the findings from our report, to summarize. First of all, in places with strong housing markets, as people on this call well know, land tends to be very expensive, making it a real challenge to create affordable housing without significant public subsidies. And sites suitable for housing can also be simply hard to get a hold of, particularly for developers without deep pockets and resources for tying up land quickly. These challenges are especially present in the kinds of locations that localities are increasingly looking to build affordable housing in healthy and accessible places near jobs, transit, services, other amenities, in areas that are gentrifying where affordable housing could help stem displacement. So what makes public land such a valuable asset is that it can provide an opportunity to reduce or eliminate high land costs from the overall affordable housing development equation. On a related note, so discounting public land can significantly reduce the need for local and state financial assistance. While just providing free or discounted land may not be sufficient to fully subsidize a 100% affordable property, it provides a valuable subsidy that can mean the difference between overall feasibility or just not happening. An example that we talked about in our report from February, this was the Bonifant at Silver Spring. This is in Montgomery County, Maryland, developed by the Montgomery Housing Partnership with Donahoe Development. Given the high costs of constructing an 11-story property, which is what was called for in this downtown setting, and given the high level of public financing they needed to cover the gap between affordable rents and development costs, staff there reported that it would have been impossible to assemble sufficient resources from the county and state to cover even moderately expensive land costs. So building, in this case, on land owned by the county that it had acquired and assembled and used as part of to build a library, which you can see in the back right corner, really enabled them to do affordable housing in an otherwise prohibitively high-cost environment. We also, uncovered that in some mixed-income scenarios, it may be possible to support a significant share of affordable housing without any additional need for subsidy, though under scenarios and conditions that we'll discuss shortly. But to get a handle on how valuable a subsidy it is to discount public land, in our report we started by looking at land as a share of total development costs. And from our sample of polled developers, we found that this ratio certainly varies from place to place and by development type even. It ranges from really about 5 to 35% in just our sample pool. But the percentage can be as high as 20 to 30% in high amenity, hot market areas. Having found that, though, we also kind of learned as we went that perhaps a more useful way to look at the value of free public land is to compare its value to the typical rental affordability gap or overall affordability gap. In the case of rental properties, this would be the difference between what lower price rents can support in debt financing versus the total cost of developing affordable housing. So I want to share with you a table that we found helpful looking at the capacity of free land to subsidize affordable housing under different mixed income housing scenarios, and these are also hypothetical. So as you can see in this table, it might be easiest to kind of just pick one column, the hot market high-rise development column. We've broken out some costs here on a per unit basis and tried to show scenarios for different market types and different product types. So mid-rise or high-rise, and it ranges from weak to hot market. So based on some information that people were sharing with us anecdotally about costs, and looking again not just the right column here, land can be upward of $100,000 per unit in these types of neighborhoods, even greater in certain parts of the DC region. And if you're looking at, say, high-rise development, let's assume $300,000 per unit in total hard and soft development costs. Total development costs then will be $400,000. Imagining affordable housing priced or targeted at roughly 60 to 80% of area median income, so just maybe at the top of tax credit eligible properties or a little bit higher. Our assumption here was that the rents on these units could support $100,000 in debt for each unit, with a resulting subsidy gap then still of $300,000. So there's a big gap to fill in doing affordable housing. So how much does it help to subsidize land, maybe because this public land is being offered for a mixed income development at reduced price. The subsidy gap for the affordable units, if the land is free, goes down to $200,000. So, which makes sense. The land costs about $100,000 per unit. Let's take that out of the equation. The subsidy gap is still $200,000 in the high-rise construction scenario here. So that's a 1/3 reduction in the gap. That is significant on its own. But if you're also offering free land for the entire property, or very discounted land, so land for the market rate units as well as the affordable units, you can see that in the highest land value locations, it doesn't take that many market rate units receiving free land to offset the subsidy gap for one affordable unit. So depending on the value of land in these three different scenarios, from going from left to right, weaker to hot, it may, offering free land for 6 market rate units for every affordable unit may cover that gap of $150,000, or maybe in the case of the hot market column, only require 2 market rate units receiving essentially a subsidy of $100,000 each, covering the $200,000 subsidy affordability gap for the affordable units. I hope that is clear, and if you have questions, we can come back to this. But this is one way we were trying to get our heads around kind of what level of affordability in a mixed income development might be feasible, and how does that vary in this simple model by the value of land in a given location. So at the bottom row, you see that this ratio of total units that could be made affordable just with the support of free land for the entire mixed income housing development, ranging from 14% to 33% in the hot market scenario. So this was influential in our thinking about policy recommendations, and even though this was a hypothetical based on the kind of best input data we could get from DC area developers. I should add that the affordability, let's go back to the slide, the affordability ratio that might be sensible policy might vary based on other factors, no doubt, related to what kind of levels of income we're trying to serve, how deeply affordable are we expecting units to be, other factors such as the condition of the site, some of the pre-development work that needs to be done on it, what other community benefits or facilities are expected. But you can see that, I won't jump around again here, but even when you're looking at free land essentially for affordable housing developments, this can be a significant subsidy, a really valuable subsidy, and it can be useful then in multiple ways. It can enable affordable housing. It can also it can increase the potential for deeper affordability. We'll hear a little bit about this from Nina's discussion of Arlington Mill residences in a second. Also, public land can provide otherwise unavailable sites for mixed income and affordable housing in amenity-rich transit-served locations. Arlington County, Virginia, and Montgomery County, Maryland, again, which were two of our settings for two of our case studies, provide good examples. In Montgomery County, few right now new affordable properties are being built because of the difficulty of finding affordable land, and none right now in what would be accessible downtown locations, with one of the exceptions being the Bonifant that we just profiled earlier. Offering public land for mixed income housing in the case of the Bonifant at a deeply discounted price made it feasible to create a rare example of affordable housing for seniors in an area that was convenient, that had convenient access to services and transit options. So depending on where your public land holdings are or where you're looking to build new public facilities that might have extra land or space for affordable housing, public land can provide otherwise unavailable footholds for affordable housing in the kinds of locations we're increasingly looking to make affordable housing possible. Fifth, another thing that we heard we didn't expect is that given that public land is a form of in-kind subsidy, discounted public land may be more valuable to developers than even direct financial assistance. Some of the developers we talked to talked about it this way, because it's less subject to budget cuts or delays in allocations, and therefore offers greater certainty and less subsidy risk. And then finally, when joint development of a public facility and housing property occurs, it can lead to infrastructure cost savings for the developer and better integration of the two land uses. So these savings may stem from sharing a parking facility, for example, and the integration of land uses can improve the accessibility of both the public facility and create a better living environment for affordable housing than normally available. Lastly, when the site is publicly owned, the locality has a lot more control over what gets done on the site. This can include ensuring long-term affordability, for example, through the use of a ground lease, sales purchase agreement. And the two Maryland and Virginia case studies we looked at, there's going to be very long-term affordability through the ground leases involved with those properties. So I just wanted to lay out some of these benefits that we discovered before we look more closely at a case study. And with that, I want to pass this over to Nina to give us a brief overview of her organization's development of Arlington Mill residences and some of the lessons that she and the organization took from its recent completion.
Great. Thank you, Robert. I'm pleased to be here this afternoon with the 80 attendees all around the listening audience. As Robert introduced me earlier, I work with the Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing. We are community-based affordable housing developer, and our focus is an urbanizing inner suburb. Just as he was talking about the example here, Arlington is an amenity-rich, transit-rich, job-rich community, and we are seeing, particularly over the last 15 years, a dramatic loss of our existing market affordable housing, actually 13,500 units net loss in our community of about 100,000 homes. So a huge, 13% swing in the affordability in our community over the last 13 years, which also means that the garden apartment inventory, which was historically the bread and butter of the affordable housing developers, is declining as well. So a lot of these older garden apartments built in the 30s, 40s, 50s, as they aged in the 80s and 90s, became moderately rehabbed and became the affordable housing of our community. But as an urbanizing community, those garden apartments are ripe for both condo conversions, redevelopment, tear downs, and also just being themselves upgraded and being less affordable with fitness centers and other tools. So in that environment, infill public affordable housing development becomes more desirable and more important. We're seeing our land values rise. The screen that Robert showed you with $100,000 per unit, that's exactly the appraised value we had on our last parcel of land near the Ballston Metro Station, $10 million for 104 units, about $100,000 per unit, which fortunately we didn't have to buy. We were redeveloping our own site. But that is something that we would have had to struggle with if we were looking for a new site, and that we are also in a community where we're increasing our density as part of addressing urbanization in general. Arlington is constantly in a rezoning process looking at where it can do more dense infill. So it makes logical sense to make affordable housing part of that process. And for a county that has a lot of one-story or two-story fire stations, libraries, schools, to say, and surface parking lots, are we using our land well as we urbanize as a community? So what were some of the key things we looked at in creating infill affordable housing? Number one was free or low-cost land. The municipality has to make a commitment that they're going to use this as a tool for affordable housing. We can't afford to pay the market sales or lease prices. In many cases, in our case, we did not, but need a local subsidy. That AHIP is our acronym for our local trust fund in Arlington. But we did need another subsidy. We needed the low-income housing tax credit. So even with free land, there's still a lot of new construction development costs to be paid, so we needed that. Other forms of a federal subsidy. We obviously needed to be very efficient in our scale and design. We're looking at tight infill sites. We can't have, sprawling greenfield kind of campuses. We needed a streamlined public process because, of course, we're changing the use, and in this case, it was a part of a kind of neighborhood-wide rezoning, but some kind of public process that didn't take forever. In the case of Arlington Mill, I'll get to the history of that in a second, but there was a process that preceded the affordable housing piece, so there was a long process, and our piece, though, was shortened. We're also able to take advantage of shared infrastructure, some reduced costs because we were sharing this land with a community center, and that was also key to help making this happen. You want to give me the next slide? So this is the Arlington Mill residences. We built 122 units on a shared parking garage. It was a 2-acre site. Arlington County actually bought this site in 1995. It had a 1-story grocery store and surface parking lot on it. It decided at that time it was going to build a community center. This was kind of the gateway between the western edge of Arlington and Fairfax County along an aging commercial corridor, Columbia Pike. As the county looked at redeveloping that, their initial thought was to do a public-private partnership. So to get a private developer to come in, build market rate housing, and in the ground rent they would pay for that, subsidize the construction of the community center. All was going okay until two things happened. One is the community decided, why are we giving up this public land and not addressing the declining affordable housing in our community? So went back to the public-private partner and said, can you do some affordable housing on site? Which the developer, not that familiar with affordable housing, said, yes, we can, but basically, in order to do that, you're going to have to way discount the land for us, even though they were only doing 20% affordable. But number two, it was 2008, and the entire market crashed, and it wasn't a good time to be putting in new market rate housing. So the county regrouped, looked at what was happening again in the community. This was 2008, 2009, declining affordable housing continuing, started at about 2000 dramatically in Arlington, and said, let's reposition this as 100% affordable housing. Ironically, in our RFP response, there were 5 bidders. Our RFP response, APA put in more ground rent than the public-private partner rent had put in by doing 20% affordable, because we were able to leverage some other tools like the low-income housing tax credit. So you can see here our sources. We developed this very economical, $302,000 per unit, including the discounted value of the ground lease. We got a $22 million tax credit allocation in 2011. Because the site had already been somewhat rezoned between 1995 and 2010 when they put out the RFP, we had very expedited approvals. We were selected in October and we applied for tax credits. October of 2010, we applied for tax credits in March of 2011. We gave the county a couple of options, but decided at the end of the day to go with a wood frame 4-story construction, so that really reduced our construction costs. The county built a shared 2-level parking garage along the entire 2-acre site, and the county took responsibility for all the site and infrastructure surrounding the parcel. So that dramatically reduced our costs. So undergrounding the utilities, the new sidewalks, bringing in new stormwater, new hookups for dry utilities and wet utilities, water, sewer, electric, gas. All of that was done by the county. So there were really kind of 2 subsidies. One was the discounted ground lease, but also sharing all these site plan costs. I think the county found this a great success. You'll see on this next slide, the impact of those subsidies enabled our organization to dramatically bring down the rents even below what we put in our RFP response. So we had put in there where we could do 10% of the units at 40% of area median income, extremely low income. But in fact, we got a very good tax credit allocation. We got lower interest rates than we budgeted. And again, with those site plan savings by the shared development, we were able to add even more affordable units. We set aside 10% of the units at 30% of area median income. Those units are targeted to permanent supportive housing. We have 13 of those in the property. And then another 20% of the units at 50% of area median income. So we were able to downsize our debt requirements, which I think is also good for the project. We have a 75-year ground lease, so the county is assured, as Robert talked about this earlier, that this will be affordable for the long term. The property reverts to the county at the end of it, so the county keeps their ownership interest. The feedback we've also gotten is that this has really been a good collaboration for the county because we work so closely with the community anyway. As there were bumps in the road, as inevitably there were in construction and delivery time, the county worked with us and we worked with them. And in hindsight, they felt better working with a nonprofit affordable housing developer than they would have having used that land and tried to co-locate their development with a private developer that wasn't as flexible. So looking kind of overview on this, what are the advantages and the challenges of this? I mean, clearly the advantage was the reduced land costs in our high cost area. That gave us that opportunity for the lower rents and reduced cash subsidy. It also reduced our pre-development risk. From when we normally go out and try and acquire a parcel on the private market, we signed a ground lease in March of 2010, and that ground lease didn't require any payments from us until construction closing. And the ground lease wrote in there that if we didn't get the low-income housing tax credit 9% award in 2011, we could have another year to reapply. That's the kind of thing that you can't get from a private seller. Really reduced our pre-development risk. We had, as I mentioned, significant shared savings with the infrastructure and the site work and the shared garage, and that's both development costs but also some operating costs. We share one ramp in our garage. We share one entry, one contract with our garage service provider. And I think we've also been pleased, both the county and APA, at some of the synergies we've found with co-locating. In this case, with a community center, they have teen programs, senior programs, preschool toddler programs, and they find that that's a benefit that we are right next door. We have our own small community center. Sometimes if they're full, they use our community center for overflow. We have a playground, they have a playground. So there's a lot of synergies, and our residents are really benefiting from that. Some of the challenges, as I mentioned, the county bought this site in 1995, and they went through a lot of iterations with their public-private partnership and with a kind of a massive, GLUP is our acronym for General Land Use Plan, but rezoning and land use plan changes which took several years. So as we look ahead to other public land situations, clearly that's going to be a barrier. We kind of came in at the tail end here, but I could see that the county had invested years in that. We had a lot more coordination costs. County's building part of the site, we're building part of the sites. Our architects had to meet, our contractors had to meet. There's a lot of additional legal costs involved with this. We have a 30-page reciprocal easement agreement, who shovels the snow on which piece of the sidewalk. And then, of course, there's an operating cost to that, too. The two operating teams that run the community center and the housing have to be in dialogue with each other, make sure they understand all these kind of complex agreements. Another price that we saw, a little less because we came in at the tail end, but as we're talking about future projects, the public is more engaged when you're on public land. They have an ownership interest in that stake, and they're very concerned about how that property is used. So I think it drove a little more attention. And we are working on another site where, actually we're working on a site, you can see here I mentioned churches as well, redeveloping churches as well as public land and old garden apartments. Sometimes you get involved with a historic preservation element. Wasn't true at Arlington Mill, but there was another site we're looking at with a public school on it, and some people are very sentimental about tearing down that school or tearing down an old church. So these are some of the issues that we dealt with at Arlington Mill, and I'm ready to help Robert out as he talks a little later about policies and how we as a community responded to Arlington Mill. It became a bit of an inspiration to the community, but as they tried to roll it out further, we saw some more challenges kind of looking at this, replicating this countywide. Back to you, Robert.
Great, Nina, thank you. So I found that really helpful to review some of the story, and what I'd like to do now is to review some of the kind of summarized lessons that emerged from looking at and listening to Nina and learning about the APA development of Arlington Mill residences, as well as some of our other case studies. Some of the lessons that emerged for developing affordable housing on public land and public land policy as it relates to affordable housing. So I'm just going to run through these fairly quickly, and then hopefully, so we have time to field questions, we can dig into your comments or reactions to some of these lessons or questions. Okay, so the first, I think, lesson we just heard about is that it can be helpful to co-locate affordable housing with new public facilities, such as community centers, but also an example we profiled in Montgomery County, it can be helpful to co-locate with a library. We've seen places do this with fire stations, which gets a little more tricky, and there's some higher construction costs involved. But other public facilities or even parking garages may be good opportunities. But there are some lessons related to doing that well. And I mean, one of the themes I pulled out, Nina, from your experience and from a couple other examples was that it may make sense to do horizontal mixed use as opposed to trying to always build the housing on top of that facility. This allows a property to move forward on its own timeline, really both properties, the facility and the housing, to move forward independently of delays that can affect the other properties, such as market conditions. But it sounds like it doesn't necessarily preclude opportunities for sharing infrastructure. And a little bit of Nina just touched on briefly was that the housing and the community center both share a garage underneath, out of which essentially it's been condoized, and Napa owns their share of the parking garage. But this helps reduce costs further with with not needing to build the garage themselves. But as Nina did talk to well, I thought it's important that there's coordination, and the lesson really is about coordinating early in the development of these two uses to ensure that architects and contractors for both the residential property and the facility are on the same page about what's going where. But I think that, you talked about these as challenges, but I think that in the end, what we saw and what we heard reported from other case studies we profiled was that the benefits outweigh the challenges. One of the things that was a challenge in many places that didn't seem to be also insurmountable was that it might be worth considering a ground lease for preserving control over the land over time. A locality might in both the Arlington case study in Montgomery County, the locality retained ownership of the land, leased the property to the developer, and in that way ensured long-term affordability, longer term than might have otherwise been the norm. It sounded like in both cases there was a learning curve for the locality to figure out the legality of it, but that it was achieved. And from my interviews with staff at both Arlington and Montgomery County, now that they've figured it out, they're looking forward to doing this again. Policy lessons. So I think that the first major lesson, and really a recommendation from our report, is that it starts at identifying sites and making it a priority to include affordable housing on public land or on public, newly developed public facilities. But it can be really helpful to empower a local agency to lead a regular cross-agency assessment of public land opportunities. Without an express mandate or a meaningful incentive to do so, many municipal agencies that are not focused on housing may be unlikely to take a hard look at their property holdings to determine if some of that land could be used to support affordable homes. We also heard that it might be helpful also to authorize a single agency to consolidate public holdings to streamline the process for both inventorying and disposing of public land. The challenge, I guess, is that people who decide land disposition may not have a relationship with the housing agency or the permitting office or the mayor's office. So, having some kind of leadership from somewhere at a locality can help identify win-win situations that might be not happening or conversations that might not be happening otherwise. I could offer some examples. I think I'm going to jump just to the next policy lesson in the interest of time. The corollary, of course, is that I think as the case in Arlington suggests, it reminds us it's really important to engage the community in this process, to include them as stakeholders early on in the stage of site development so that they're fully informed participants in subsequent planning processes and not feeling like this came out of left field. That said, and I think this is one of the things that Arlington County did well, is it had clear criteria and a pretty rigorous process for identifying truly suitable public land sites for affordable housing. So here are four that I've kind of lifted up. The idea of ensuring that a site is clear of legal encumbrances such as environmental or historic preservation restrictions. It's clean, doesn't have environmental contamination. It's adequately sized and shaped so that multifamily housing can support a sufficient number of units to be managed and operated efficiently. And then lastly, it's located in an accessible location near frequent transit, ideally near daily necessities and economic and educational opportunities. I think it's important that in a community-driven or engaged process that these criteria are also part of the decision-making and educational process. Number 3 or 4, let's see, is that 3? It's 4. It's important to adopt a policy that protects suitable public land and enables its development with affordable housing. And there are really two components of this that we heard that seem really promising. One is to ensure that all capital improvement projects are reviewed for their potential to include residential development, including affordable housing. And second, to set minimal affordability standards or expectations for that residential development. So some examples, just most close to home, in Washington, D.C. this past year, the city set a new policy with affordability standards for multifamily housing that gets built on surplus public land. So all new multifamily housing on public land must include at least 20 to 30% affordable housing. And the exact level, interestingly enough, depends on the location. So the percentage rises to 30% for sites that are really close to transit, a half mile from a metro station or a quarter mile of a streetcar line or a quarter mile of a major bus route. So they set it as a range, and they valued transit proximity, which may in turn be a proxy for higher land cost areas. But it also reflects the value they place on making sure affordable housing is available and on an ongoing basis near quality transit. For some sites, it might make sense to reserve the site for 100% affordable housing, and for others, especially where there's a potential to leverage affordable housing through high rents and home prices, to do mixed income housing. But we talked about earlier about the importance of setting the right affordability expectations for mixed income housing. And looking at the table of hypothetical scenarios again, I think it's really important to understand the relationship between the value of the land that you're discounting and the affordability gap for producing below market rate housing, as that can really kind of clarify the potential for cross-subsidizing the affordable housing component. Skipping still ahead, and related to what we just discussed, it's important to identify publicly owned land in accessible high-value areas. So free land in desirable areas can subsidize the highest shares or deepest levels of affordability. Going back to our columns and our scenarios, it was in the highest land value areas where you could cross-subsidize just with free land up to 33% affordable housing. But there are also, these are also places where affordable housing often struggles to get a foothold. And I wanted to ask Nina about that. How difficult is it in Arlington to otherwise build in emerging areas like Columbia Pike, or the Boston Corridor without access to county land?
I would say that in the highly desirable corridors, transit-rich corridors, when we've tried to bid on broker-offered properties, there are often a dozen very well-financed developers that are competing against us, and they can way out-compete. They're looking at very low cap rates and can put a lot of money on the table and can move quickly. So public land, and I would put in that also semi-public land, churches, and then building on our own land, nonprofit land banking, are pretty much the only tools we have in Arlington. I don't know that we can compete on the private land market today.
This may be related to what you just said, but I think that another idea that came up that seemed particularly important and is actually built into the recent DC policy was allowing the city agency to accept less than top dollar bids when reviewing proposals. So this can permit the sale, for example, of public land for affordable housing at less than appraised prices. And it may be a way to then accept a bid that, while maybe not the top bid, offers a deeper level of affordability or greater public benefits of other types. And lastly, the idea that it is important to discount public land, but it's also important to still have a trust fund or another local source that can provide financial subsidy for affordable housing. So I think from the scenarios we looked at, we saw that discounted public land may not always be sufficient for achieving deep affordability or covering the entire affordability gap, especially in high construction cost areas. So I wanted to kind of leave with this point that a public land strategy for affordable housing can be really valuable, but it isn't a substitute for also having a local source of financing. And Nina, is that consistent with what you just said? How does that play out in Arlington?
Oh yes, absolutely. In fact, you might need them together. We didn't happen to need that at Arlington Mill Residences, but at some other infill sites we're looking at, we will need to use the local subsidy as well. And it's such a flexible tool, so it helps you if you find this great garden apartment complex that is on the market and can be preserved for affordable housing. You want to have that soft financing tool in addition to the public land tool. Absolutely.
And I skipped past this and talking about our recommendation related to engaging the community, but I'm wondering, from your experience, can this be done in a constructive way?
Yeah, so after Arlington Mill Residences came up, there was a lot of enthusiasm, and the county board directed the county staff to come up with a list of all these sites, as you said, Robert, with the criteria to see how many other places they could replicate this, and it created its own backlash. It was, you know, 8 primary sites and another 15 secondary sites, and boy, everybody had one in their backyard, and it suddenly seemed very threatening. So, you know, how do you manage that? By putting all those sites on the table and not having them totally thought out. Normally in Arlington, when we do something like this, come in for affordable housing, there's a lot of roll-up to it, you know, meeting with the neighbors, meeting with the civic associations. So the county basically took a step back, and now they're doing a very interactive public lands process, which includes planning for schools, which we also need, for other infrastructure needs like fire stations and libraries, and affordable housing. And the hope is, by making that a very public process, but also dealing with all these needs at the same time, you know, the neighbors in one neighborhood will understand, well, this makes sense that the affordable housing is coming here because the library is going here, or educating the community, but on a community-wide basis, but it has to be a very ambitious effort. And they're meeting every 2 weeks for a year, so it's 100 people in the room, lots of charrettes. So I think we've had both lessons. If you try and jump the queue and give people a list, it created backlash, but now we're doing it, I think, really methodically, hopefully to come up with that list of future long-range sites that are designated for affordable housing and other public needs at the same time.
Great, thank you. Well, so I think we should stop there and let Radia share with us some of the questions that have come in.
Absolutely. So we'll go ahead and get started. I am seeing a couple questions about whether or not these slides will be available. So I guess I'll just go ahead and answer that one and say that if you are registered for the webinar, slides will be sent via email as well as a recording of the webinar sometime early next week. And so now it looks like our first question is, in relation to the Arlington Mills residences, do you know the source of funds the county used to build the infrastructure?
Yes, the county used some park and recreation bond financing that was approved by the voters, and they lumped that into some other parks works they were doing, about $30 million for the community center.
Okay, and then we have another question relating to the Arlington Mills. Does the development cost include land costs?
The slide that we put up does include the discounted, I believe, $49,000. Yeah, it includes the full 7, and it includes the $6 million discount that they gave us. That's at $49,000 per unit.
Okay. And again, I will remind all, I know we did go through some of the slides pretty quickly. We will be sending out links to the PowerPoint slides and to a recording of this webinar at a later date. Let's see, we have another question here. What was the lease rent to the county for the Arlington Mill development?
It was $1.5 million. The site was appraised at $7.5 million. We got a $6 million discount, and we made an upfront one-time cash payment of $1.5 million.
Okay. All right, we have another question here. Has there been any research done to understand why builders or contractors' cost per square foot is going up so much? Looks like it's a two-part question. So did you want to take that part first?
You know, that's a really good question. I've heard our contractors talk about all kinds of things, including, you know, competition for building supplies with China, labor costs. Mostly that's over my pay grade, though. You know, we get our cost estimates and grimace and move on. So I'm not sure why.
Okay. Robert, did you have any thoughts on that?
Nothing to add beyond that.
Right.
Covered the demand for these materials as a driver.
Okay, let me just run through and see if we're missing any questions here.
Well, while you're thinking about it, Rene, there is one thing that is driving our costs, which is as we become a more urbanized community, I think we're raising our expectations for these infill developments. In other words, we're putting in more wider sidewalks, street trees. We're investing more in the street appearance. The cost of construction is higher because we're in an infill site, so the contractors have limited work hours, limited parking availability. So I do think there is a cost differential in an infill location, a tight urban location, versus building in a greenfield location.
Interesting. And there's another part to this question. It mentions that there are no nonprofit contractors or builders. So I'm interested to know if either you or Robert know of any that we can share with the attendees on this webinar today.
I don't know of any.
Okay.
Nor do I.
Okay.
Question, though.
Yeah, it's a good question and definitely something worth thinking about. So it looks like those are all of the questions that we have. So Robert and Nina, do you all have any closing remarks? It looks like we do have a few minutes here. So any closing remarks before I lead us out?
Well, I'm just curious, not a closing remark yet, but an invitation to people on the call to share their feedback about some of these recommendations. So, looking really at the policy, we talked about kind of this creating a proactive process to identify sites using clear criteria, engaging the community. But then where it gets a little more controversial are policies that set standard expectations of affordability for public land. Whether it's that all capital improvement projects have to defend their lack of inclusion of affordable housing or show how they would include affordable housing, which is essentially what Montgomery County, Maryland has set up, or having just simply minimum percentages across the board for surplus land. I think having a rigid affordability expectation of any given site might be counterproductive, but it's intriguing to me how DC went about their recent policy where they said if we're going to build housing on this site and it's multifamily housing, it needs to include at least 20 to 30% affordability, and they vary by location. I think that it starts the conversation at the right place. Now, I'll add a couple more details to this policy that I think were noteworthy that were mentioned in the report. First of all, this is fairly deeply affordable housing, so at least half of the for-sale homes must be affordable to households earning less than 50% of AMI, and a quarter of the rental homes must be affordable to households at 30% of AMI or lower, so extremely low-income households. The remaining three-quarters at 50% of AMI. So these are also expectations for deep levels of affordability on their sites. Now, the flexibility that the policy builds in is that the mayor may waive this requirement as necessary, but the ordinance gives, in this case her, only certain circumstances under which she can waive that affordability requirement or tweak it, such as the fact that the appraised value of the site is insufficient to support affordable housing in light of all the other public sources of financing available and in light of the discount that they're able to offer, or that the disposition of this property is crucial to enabling the financing of a significant public facility. So it builds in some flexibility, which I think in two ways, especially I think valuable is in the case that the appraised value of the site, really the land value discount, in case it's not great enough to support affordable housing, assuming that they can also pull in some of the Housing Production Trust Fund dollars. What intrigues me then is it sets standards, but there's some flexibility. I'm curious if anyone on the call has any comments or questions about that, if they've seen that used elsewhere.
Okay, well, while you were talking, Robert, we did get a few more questions, so I'll just go through those in the few minutes we have left. It seems like in both of these examples, the public agency has had flexibility in actually selling or gifting the land. Have you seen any success with public land that is not owned by a local jurisdiction, but say a transit agency with restrictions from federal funding that is required to sell at market or recover costs of purchase of the land?
I think that the first part sounds like the common scenario, that a transit agency maybe selling land may need to get full market value for it, so maybe selling it at full market value, but maybe then asking as part of the land disposition that there's a degree of affordability, with the assumption that there's another source of financing that can help make that affordability possible. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but we also see schools, looking at potential for housing on redeveloped sites. What do you think?
I do know that we had a conversation with VDOT, Virginia Department of Transportation, about some right-of-way land, and they did say that they would have to appraise it if APA, the nonprofit, was the direct purchaser. But if the county, the municipality, had approached them directly, they did have governing authority to donate it to the municipality. So I do think there are maybe some backroads ways to get the federal or state money, federal or state land contributed to the municipality, which can then turn around and do the affordable housing piece as part of their mission. And I actually saw that 10 years ago in Anaheim, California. There was some right-of-way land that the municipality got from the state adjacent to some freeways, and they put out an RFP and made kind of small supportive housing buildings along that right-of-way.
All right, looks like we have another question here. And the asker is particularly asking you, Robert, if you have a thought about the challenges or solutions to working with FTA on allowing non-commuters to use FTA-funded parking facilities.
That is an interesting question. I don't have any thoughts about that. I think that some of our colleagues in the field that have really taken a deep dive into looking at the federal regulations and the kind of the legal requirements on transit agencies might have a better level of insight. I think of, for example, the Enterprise Community Partners has done some good work at kind of bird-dogging federal regulations as they evolve. And folk like Michael Spots, for example, at Enterprise, might be a good person to look up to pitch that question.
Okay, it looks like we have another question here. Let me see. Where can we see a copy of the Washington, D.C. policy?
That is a good question. It's hard to find online, and but we could include a PDF of it in our email to registrants. It includes a link to the recording of this presentation. Or I could maybe see if in fact it's in their accessible kind of legislative website and send out a link. I don't know off the top of my hand though. It's basically though, if you're handy with the research, it's DC Act 20-485, and it was enacted by the DC government in the latter part of 2014. I want to say December, or if not November.
Okay. All right, so it looks like we have answered all of the questions here, and we have about a minute left. So I just want to close this out by thanking everyone for attending today. In a few seconds, you should see contact information for Robert and Nina, as well as some links to the resources that were discussed in today's webinar. So if you didn't get your question answered or you want to connect with either Robert or Nina, their information is on the screen. And again, just thank you all for attending and for asking questions. And again, thanks to Capital One for supporting our NHC webinar series. If you are interested in getting more information about upcoming webinars that we have, including the registration links, or you want to see some resources from past webinars, you can visit nhc.org and click on the Capital One webinars button at the top right-hand corner of our screen. So we hope that you all will join us again for future webinars and future events. And thank you again for joining us. Have a good afternoon.